A decorated black pilot, fresh from a long-haul international flight, walks into the airport, ready to head home to his family. But just minutes after stepping off the plane, his world shifts. A racist security officer stops him without reason, questions his credentials, and humiliates him in front of stunned passengers. He tries to remain calm, knowing how quickly these situations can escalate, but then, something happens that no one expects. 7 minutes later, that same officer is escorted out in disgrace, and what follows sets off a ripple effect that shakes the entire airline industry. Stay with me, this is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carries the scent of jet fuel and possibility, mingling with the pre-dawn quiet of an airport just beginning to stir. Marcus Washington adjusted his tie, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle over his shoulders like an old, well-worn flight jacket. It wasn't just another day. It never was. For 15 years, he had walked through terminals like this, past glass windows reflecting the steel birds waiting on the tarmac, past passengers clutching coffee cups and passports, each one trusting that a stranger in uniform would lift them into the sky and carry them safely to their destination. That stranger was him, and he had never taken it lightly. He stepped onto the jet bridge, the sound of his polished shoes clicking against the metal ramp, each step a beat in the symphony of pre-flight preparations. The Boeing 787, sleek and waiting, sat like a giant poised for takeoff, and as he entered the cockpit, the familiar hum of instruments and switches greeted him like an old friend. To some, flying was just physics, a calculated dance of thrust and lift, but to Marcus it was something closer to magic. He had known since he was 8 years old, standing at the fence of Hartsfield-Jackson in Atlanta, watching planes disappear into the endless blue, that this was what he was meant to do. Liam Riley, his first officer, greeted him with an easy grin, already settled into his seat, flipping through checklists with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "Morning, Captain. Ready for Chicago?" "As ready as ever," Marcus replied, setting his flight bag down and running his fingers over the yoke, a habit, a ritual, a quiet acknowledgement that the power to defy gravity rested, quite literally, in his hands. The rhythm of pre-flight continued: fuel calculations, weather briefings, system checks. Outside, the ground crew moved with precision, loading luggage, refueling, making the unseen machine of air travel hum smoothly forward. In the cabin, flight attendants prepared for passengers, securing carts, straightening seatbelts, all while the first rays of morning light painted golden streaks over the fuselage. It was the calm before the controlled storm of takeoff. Jessica Chun, the lead flight attendant, popped her head into the cockpit. "All set in first class, Captain. Would you like a coffee before we push back?" Marcus nodded. "That'd be great, thanks." Jessica returned moments later, handing him the cup with a smile. "Just the way you like it." He took a sip, expecting the familiar warmth, the slightly bitter edge softened by sugar, the quiet comfort of a pilot's pre-flight routine. But the second the liquid touched his tongue, something was wrong. Bitter, acrid, a taste that did not belong. For a moment he hesitated, setting the cup down, a slow unease creeping in. Pilots trust their instincts, it's what keeps them alive when things go south at 35,000 feet. And right now, his instincts told him something was off. He glanced toward Liam, who was sipping his own coffee without concern. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a bad batch, an overused coffee pot in the galley. But a thought, unwelcome and persistent, nudged at the back of his mind. He had learned to recognize the signs, the subtle shifts in the air, the moments when something unspoken passes between people. And as he ran through the events of the morning, he thought about Cassandra Whitfield, the senior flight attendant. The way her greeting had been just a little colder than usual. The way her eyes had met his for a second too short, like someone avoiding contact not out of shyness, but because they didn't want to see. He thought about Vanessa, the new hire, the way she had hesitated when he asked her about her first week, the way she had said, "It's been educational," before catching herself. Marcus wasn't a man who jumped to conclusions. The cockpit was no place for impulse or paranoia. But he also wasn't a man who ignored his gut. He pressed the call button, his voice steady, his decision already made. "Jessica, could you come back to the cockpit for a moment?" Moments later, she appeared, her professionalism unshaken. "Yes, Captain." Marcus held up the cup. "Who poured this?" Jessica blinked, then frowned slightly. "I didn't. I thought Vanessa might have, but—" She hesitated, lowering her voice. "I saw Cassandra in here earlier. I assumed she was checking something with Liam." Liam looked up, brow furrowing. "She did stop by. Said she needed to update the meal count for Chicago." Marcus felt a slow, steady tension build in his chest. It was a feeling he had learned to recognize. The same feeling that had saved him when a storm cell appeared out of nowhere over the Atlantic. When an engine failure forced an emergency landing in Denver. When instinct had been the only thing standing between him and disaster. "Thank you, Jessica," he said, his voice even. "Could you ask Cassandra to come to the cockpit?" Jessica hesitated just a fraction of a second before nodding. "Of course." When Cassandra appeared, her expression was unreadable, poised, practiced. "You needed to see me, Captain?" Marcus looked at her, reading the lines of her face. The way her lips pressed just a little too tightly together, the flicker of something behind her eyes. "Jessica mentioned you were in the cockpit while I was out," he said evenly. "Did you touch my coffee?" A heartbeat. Pause just long enough to matter. "I don't understand what you're implying, Captain." "I'm not implying anything," Marcus said, his voice calm, controlled. "I'm asking a direct question." A flicker barely there. A hesitation too small for most people to notice, but Marcus noticed everything. "Absolutely not," she said, her voice clipped, defensive. "This is completely inappropriate. If you have concerns about my professionalism, they should be addressed through proper channels." Marcus studied her. He had been in cockpits with failing engines, in skies where turbulence slammed the plane like an angry god, in moments where instinct alone had kept metal and humanity from plummeting into the sea. And right now, his instincts told him the truth. "Then you won't mind if we save this cup and have it tested when we land." Something flickered in Cassandra's expression, brief. But there, a crack in the veneer. Marcus didn't move, didn't blink, didn't let his voice waver. Because flying wasn't just about skill. It was about control. About knowing when to act. About knowing when something was about to go wrong before it did. And right now, he knew. This flight had just become something more than routine. The engines roared to life, a low, steady hum that sent a familiar vibration through the cockpit, through the floor beneath Marcus Washington's feet, through the very air inside the plane. It was a sound he had heard thousands of times before, a sound that usually signaled control, routine, order. But today it felt different. It felt like a drumbeat, an omen, the prelude to something unseen, something just outside his grasp. He sat still, hands resting on the control yoke, his fingers loose but ready, his mind running through the pre-flight checklist on autopilot while his instincts screamed for his attention. The coffee cup still sat there, a quiet accusation, a piece of evidence, its dark surface untouched since that first sip had sent a jolt of warning through his body. In this moment, it was more than just coffee. It was a question, a challenge, a crack in the foundation of trust that every flight depended on. Liam glanced at him, sensing the shift in energy, the kind of silent, invisible current that can change the course of a flight before it even leaves the ground. "You good, Captain?" he asked, his voice low, meant only for Marcus to hear. Marcus nodded once, a single, measured movement. "We'll see." Outside, the runway stretched ahead, a long silver ribbon gleaming under the morning light. Flight attendants secured the cabin, checked seatbelts, soothed nervous passengers who clutched their armrests, as if sheer willpower alone could keep a plane in the sky. Businessmen scrolled through emails, mothers adjusted blankets over sleeping children. A young couple held hands tightly, exchanging excited glances about whatever waited for them in Chicago. They trusted him. Every single one of them trusted him without ever knowing his name, without ever questioning whether he was worthy of that trust. And that was the part that mattered most. Pilot doesn't just fly a plane. He carries lives. He carries dreams, reunions, business deals, whispered airport goodbyes, the quiet weight of people who simply want to go home. He reached for the intercom, pressing the button with practiced ease. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Washington. We are cleared for takeoff, and in just a few moments we'll be on our way to Chicago. Flight time is approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes, with smooth conditions expected for most of the route. We appreciate you flying with us today, and we look forward to a safe and comfort. The words rolled out smoothly, a script perfected over years, but even as he spoke them, his mind stayed locked on Cassandra Whitfield. She sat in the back of the plane now, secured in the jump seat, barred from duty, stripped of her authority. She had tried to regain control, had thrown out words like baseless accusations and completely inappropriate. But Marcus had seen through the act. People who are innocent don't panic when you tell them the truth is coming. People who have nothing to hide don't flinch at the suggestion of evidence. He had spent too many years reading people, too many hours in airports and cockpits and break rooms filled with the kind of quiet conversations that only happen when the doors are closed and the passengers are out of earshot. He knew how to spot the ones who smiled at you while quietly hoping you wouldn't last. The plane lurched forward, rolling down the runway, gathering speed, the engines roaring in a crescendo that built and built until suddenly, effortlessly, the wheels left the ground. That moment when metal and gravity come to an understanding, when the impossible happens for the millionth time, never lost its magic. Even now, even after everything, Marcus felt the familiar rush as the city below shrank, as the clouds opened their arms, welcoming them into the sky. At cruising altitude, he handed control to Liam and unbuckled his harness. "I'll be back," he said, stepping out of the cockpit with the quiet authority of a man who understood the weight of his own presence. He moved down the narrow aisle, past passengers lost in movies and books, past the hum of whispered conversations and the clatter of plastic cups against tray tables. When he reached the rear of the plane, he found Jessica waiting, her face tight, her professionalism stretched thin over her concern. "She hasn't said a word," Jessica whispered, "just sitting there, staring out the window." Marcus nodded and stepped forward. Cassandra looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. But there was something there, something shifting behind her eyes. "You want to tell me why?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice low, steady, controlled. "Why do this? Why risk everything just to—" He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. "Was it worth it?" Cassandra laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You don't understand, do you?" she said, shaking her head. "You really think this is about coffee?" Marcus didn't flinch. "No, I don't." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You think because you're in that uniform, because you sit in that seat up there, that you've won? That it changes anything?" He held her gaze unshaken. "It changes everything." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You still don't belong." Marcus let the words settle between them, let the weight of them fill the space like turbulence waiting to hit. Then, he leaned in just enough for only her to hear. "And yet, here I am." He didn't wait for her to respond. He turned, walked back up the aisle, returned to his seat in the cockpit. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly in every direction, blue and vast, limitless. And that was the truth of it, wasn't it? No matter who thought he didn't belong, no matter how many tried to keep him grounded, no matter how many times he was forced to prove himself over and over again, he would always rise. 35,000 feet above the earth, the world below looked like a map someone had folded too many times. Fields stretched in patchwork quilts of green and gold. Rivers snaked through valleys like veins carrying history, and the clouds hovered in their usual indifferent way, as if they had seen it all before. Up here, things should have been simple. The laws of physics, of lift and thrust, governed everything. Numbers didn't lie, instruments didn't hold grudges, and the sky did not care who flew through it. And yet, inside this aircraft, Marcus Washington knew that trust was not measured in altitude. It was measured in something far more fragile. He had spent years building it, brick by brick, in a profession where he had been told, in ways both subtle and blunt, that he did not belong. He had walked into briefing rooms where the pause, the too long glance at his uniform, the unreadable flicker in someone's eye spoke before words ever did. He had sat in jump seats across from captains who never quite let their guard down, flight attendants who made assumptions before they learned his name, passengers who hesitated just a second too long before boarding when they saw him in the cockpit. But he had flown anyway, because the sky didn't belong to anyone, and neither did he. The hum of the engines filled the cockpit, steady, rhythmic, the pulse of a machine built to defy gravity. Liam sat beside him, making quiet adjustments, the glow of the instrument panel washing his face in cool blues and greens. The flight was smooth now, the climb behind them, the air calm. It was the moment in every flight where everything settled, when the work became routine, when the hardest part should have been over. But Marcus knew better. The hardest part was still ahead. He pressed the intercom. "Jessica, can you join me in the cockpit?" Seconds later, the door opened, and Jessica stepped in. Her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her professionalism battling the tension in her shoulders. "Captain." Marcus reached for the coffee cup, the one he had barely touched, the one that still sat there like an unanswered question. He turned it in his hands, watching the dark liquid ripple against the porcelain rim. "I need you to tell me again who brought this in?" Jessica shifted her weight, her fingers tightening around each other. "Like I said before, Captain, I thought Vanessa did. But then she told me she didn't. And I saw Cassandra here earlier." Liam glanced between them, the silence stretching. Marcus finally set the cup down. "Did you see her touch it?" Jessica hesitated. "I wasn't paying attention, but she was here, alone. That was enough." Marcus had spent a lifetime learning to trust instincts that others dismissed. The same instincts that told him to check a weather pattern twice, to listen for the smallest change in engine pitch, to adjust for wind shear before the instruments caught it. The same instincts that had kept him alive in storms, in emergencies, in moments where a fraction of a second made all the difference. And those instincts were telling him that Cassandra had done something. He pressed the call button again. "Daniel, please bring Miss Whitfield to the cockpit." When the door opened again, Cassandra stepped in, and the tension in the air shifted. She stood straight, her uniform crisp, her hands at her sides, her face a mask of perfect indifference. But Marcus knew a mask when he saw one. "You were in the cockpit earlier," he said, his voice calm, controlled. "Yes," she answered. "Did you touch my coffee?" A beat, a hesitation so small, so quick that most people wouldn't have caught it. But Marcus wasn't most people. "No," she said. He studied her. She didn't fidget. She didn't blink too much or too little. She had rehearsed this. "You're sure?" Her chin lifted slightly. "I am." He let the silence stretch, let it press down on her like cabin pressure shifting, let it settle in the space between them until the truth had nowhere left to hide. Then he nodded. "Okay. Then you won't mind if we have it tested when we land." Her breath caught. It was quick, almost invisible, but it was there. A flicker of something behind her eyes. Panic? No, it wasn't panic. It was calculation. She forced a tight smile. "Of course not." Marcus nodded again, keeping his face neutral, keeping his voice steady. "Good. That's all." She turned, walked out, and the moment the door closed behind her, Liam exhaled, shaking his head. "Damn." Jessica crossed her arms. "Captain, what do you think she—" "I don't know," Marcus interrupted, "but I intend to find out." Outside the cockpit, Cassandra walked back to the galley, her pulse hammering against her ribs, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. She had underestimated him. That was her mistake. She thought he would ignore it, brush it off, dismiss the bitterness in his coffee as something minor, something not worth questioning. But he hadn't. He had done what men like him always did, refused to let things go, refused to be silent. And now she had a problem. But problems had solutions. She reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. There were people who wouldn't want a situation like this to reach corporate. People who would rather see it handled quietly, discreetly. Her hand tightened around the device. Marcus Washington thought he had won something. He hadn't even started to lose yet. Chicago shimmered in the morning light, the skyline stretching toward the clouds like a promise. O'Hare International buzzed with its usual controlled chaos, passengers rushing toward gates, announcements crackling over the intercom, luggage wheels humming against polished floors. But inside Flight 227's cockpit, the hum of routine had been broken, replaced by something heavier, something unspoken yet undeniable. Marcus Washington taxied the aircraft toward the gate with the same precision he had practiced his entire career, but his mind was already racing ahead. The moment those wheels stopped, the moment that door opened, everything would change. He powered down the engines, feeling the familiar click of switches beneath his fingertips. Liam sat beside him, quiet, watchful, his fingers resting near the throttle as if grounding himself. The usual post-flight checklist sat untouched between them, neither man reaching for it yet. "Security's waiting," Liam finally said, his voice low. Marcus nodded, glancing at the reflection in the dark screen in front of him. His own face stared back, calm, composed, the face of a man who had spent years learning to control every flicker of emotion. Flying demanded that. No matter the storm, no matter the malfunction, no matter the chaos unfolding behind the cockpit door, the pilot remained steady. Because the moment you let turbulence inside, you lost. The chime for the seatbelt sign cut through the quiet. Cabin doors unlocked. Flight attendants moved into position. Outside, the jet bridge crept closer, a slow metallic movement that felt like the tightening of a noose. Marcus unbuckled, standing with the smooth efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times. "Let's finish this flight," he said, voice steady. The cockpit door swung open, revealing the narrow aisle beyond. Passengers gathered their belongings, stretching limbs, adjusting ties, scrolling through emails. To them, it had been just another flight, an easy one, a smooth ride, thanks to the man they would never think twice about as they stepped onto solid ground. But in the rear of the plane, it was a different story. Cassandra Whitfield sat in the jump seat, her arms crossed tightly, her chin lifted in defiance, but Marcus saw the truth beneath it. She wasn't as composed as she wanted to be. The tension in her jaw, the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her eyes flicked toward the front every few seconds, all of it betrayed her. Jessica stood nearby, arms folded, her face unreadable. Daniel, the senior flight attendant, hovered beside her, shifting his weight from foot to foot. The entire crew had felt it, the shift, the weight of something breaking open midair. A uniformed officer stepped onto the plane, his presence a sharp contrast to the civilian buzz of the passengers still deplaning. His gaze found Marcus immediately, a brief nod of recognition. "Captain Washington." Marcus returned the nod. "She's in the back." The officer moved with quiet authority, weaving through the passengers who were still unaware that something far beyond their itinerary had played out above the clouds. As he approached Cassandra, Marcus saw it just for a second, a flicker of something in her eyes. Not fear, not guilt, resentment. "You can't be serious," she scoffed, shaking her head as the officer stopped in front of her. "Over a cup of coffee?" But they all knew it wasn't about coffee. The officer didn't engage. "Miss Whitfield, we need you to come with us." Cassandra exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "This is ridiculous." She stopped herself, her eyes cutting toward Marcus. "This is harassment, and you know it." "Ma'am, you can make your statements at the terminal," the officer replied, his tone even, offering no room for debate. Passengers were staring now, murmurs trickling through the cabin. The ones who had assumed Cassandra's authority now saw her for what she was, a woman being escorted off a plane in disgrace. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. People like her never expected to be held accountable. They relied on the benefit of the doubt, on the unspoken rules that had allowed them to operate unchecked for years. But today the rules were different. Today the truth had altitude. As Cassandra stood, she leveled a look at Marcus, something dark and burning. "You think this changes anything?" she muttered under her breath. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. The world was changing with or without her. She was led off the plane, her heels clicking against the narrow aisle, a sound that once might have commanded authority but now carried only weight. The weight of consequences. Marcus turned, catching Jessica's gaze. "You all right?" he asked. She exhaled, nodding. "I am now." They exited the plane together, stepping into the bright, clinical light of the terminal. The air felt different here, heavier, grounded. A flight crew stood at the gate for the return trip, chatting casually, unaware of the storm that had just passed. In the distance, Cassandra disappeared into the security office, swallowed by the same system she had once believed would always be on her side. Liam stepped beside him. "You did the right thing." Marcus nodded, though the weight of it hadn't settled yet. "Yeah," he murmured. "I did." A text buzzed on his phone. "Asia, call me when you land." He let out a slow breath. The flight was over, the landing complete. But some turbulence doesn't end when the wheels touch down. Some storms take longer to clear. The airport terminal hummed with the familiar rhythm of arrivals and departures, of people moving with purpose, dragging suitcases heavy with memories, rushing toward waiting cars, toward home, toward something known. But Marcus Washington stood still. The weight of the last few hours settled into his bones like turbulence that refuses to smooth out even after the plane has leveled off. Cassandra Whitfield was gone, escorted from the aircraft, her authority stripped, her final words still lingering in the back of his mind. "You think this changes anything?" He knew that question wasn't really for him. It was for the world that had allowed people like her to move without consequence for so long. And maybe she was right. Maybe some things wouldn't change overnight. But that didn't mean they couldn't change at all. His phone buzzed again in his palm. "Asia, you good? Call me." He exhaled, forcing himself to step forward, to push through the inertia of the moment. The job wasn't just about flying the plane. It was about what came after, about walking back into the world and carrying the weight of the choices made at 35,000 feet. Liam fell into step beside him, hands in his pockets, the usual easy grin absent from his face. "That was something," he said, shaking his head slightly, as if trying to clear the last remnants of the flight from his thoughts. "You think she's really gonna fight it?" Marcus gave a small, humorless chuckle. "Of course she is. People like her always do." They reached the crew exit, stepping into the crisp Chicago air. The wind carried the scent of jet fuel and possibility, the way it always did in airports, where goodbyes and beginnings existed in the same breath. A black sedan idled at the curb, waiting for Marcus. He turned to Liam, the exhaustion beginning to creep into his voice. "You staying in town tonight?" Liam shook his head. "Nah, catching the next leg out to Dallas." "But, hey man, I just want to say," he paused, running a hand through his hair before meeting Marcus's gaze. "You handled that better than I would have, and better than a lot of people would have. That wasn't just about you." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of those words, the quiet acknowledgement of the fight beneath the surface. "It never is." They clasped hands in a firm shake, an understanding passing between them. Then, Liam was gone, disappearing into the airport, back into the machine that kept the world moving. Marcus slid into the back seat of the waiting car, the familiar voice of his wife filling his ears before the door even closed. "You finally called," Asia said, her tone laced with concern and something else, something she never let slip into words, but that Marcus could always hear. The fear that never left her completely, the worry she carried every time he stepped into that cockpit. Not for his ability, but for the world he had to navigate on the ground. "Sorry," he exhaled, leaning back against the headrest. "It's been a long day." "Yeah, I saw," she said, and he could hear the click-click of her scrolling through headlines. "It's already out there. Flight attendant removed after alleged incident with Captain Washington." His jaw tightened. "They're calling it alleged?" "They always do at first," Asia said. "But they're talking about it. That's something." Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He knew how this worked. People would pick sides. Some would say it was an overreaction. Others would say it was about time. The airline would issue a statement full of corporate sanitized words about policies and investigations, and somewhere in the fine print, the truth would be diluted into something more palatable. So what happens now? Asia asked. Now, the real turbulence. Now, I meet with corporate in the morning, he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion settling into his bones. And then we see if they actually mean what they say when they talk about zero tolerance. Asia was quiet for a beat. Then, you want my guess? Marcus let out a short laugh. Not really. They'll try to sweep it, she said anyway. They'll say the right things, offer you some PR-approved apology, and hope this goes away quietly. She wasn't wrong. He knew it. And yet, something inside him refused to let that be the answer. I'm not letting this go, he said, his voice calm but firm. A pause. Then a soft sigh on the other end of the line. I know, Asia murmured. That's why I married you. The car moved through the city, past steel and glass and streets lined with stories, past people who would never know his name but who had unknowingly been part of his fight long before today. The fight to exist in spaces that weren't built for him. The fight to rise, to stay steady when others wanted to see him fall. The truth was, Cassandra's words weren't wrong. You think this changes anything? Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But change never came all at once. It came in small moments, in choices made when no one was watching, in voices that refused to be quieted. Tomorrow he would walk into that meeting. He would sit across from executives who would try to smooth this over, who would measure their words carefully, who would look at him and see not just a pilot but a problem. And he would remind them of something they often forgot. He wasn't just a pilot. He was the storm. The conference room smelled like fresh coffee and polished wood, the kind of corporate sterility designed to project power without offering warmth. The walls were lined with framed photographs of Transcontinental Airways' most impressive moments, record-breaking flights, award-winning employees, a carefully curated image of diversity and excellence. But Marcus Washington knew better. He had spent years inside the machinery of this industry, long enough to understand that what was on display was never the full picture. The real stories, the ones that mattered, never made it into the brochures. They were the quiet battles fought in briefing rooms, in cockpits, in the spaces where decisions were made behind closed doors. And today he was walking straight into one of those rooms. The executives were already seated when he entered. 5 men, 2 women, all in sharp suits, their expressions a careful balance of concern and control. The head of human resources, a woman named Regina Howard, sat in the center. She was the kind of corporate figure who spoke in measured tones, every word chosen with precision. To her left was James Mercer, the airline's chief pilot for the Northeast region, a man Marcus had flown with once before. His eyes held something close to sympathy, but sympathy didn't mean action. Captain Washington, Regina began, offering a tight smile. Thank you for coming in. We know this has been a difficult situation, and we appreciate your professionalism throughout. Marcus nodded, taking his seat. Difficult situation was an interesting choice of words. Not unacceptable, not unethical, not a blatant violation of trust. Just difficult. Let's start with the facts, Regina continued, folding her hands neatly on the table. Cassandra Whitfield has been placed on indefinite suspension pending a full investigation. We take incidents like this very seriously. Marcus leaned forward, clasping his hands together, keeping his voice even. And what does full investigation mean in this case? Regina exchanged a glance with James, then cleared her throat. It means we will be reviewing Ms. Whitfield's conduct, speaking to all involved parties, and determining the appropriate course of action in accordance with company policy. Marcus exhaled slowly. He had heard the script before. And what about accountability? Regina blinked, as if the word itself was foreign in this setting. I'm not sure I follow. Marcus kept his gaze steady. Cassandra didn't just make a mistake. She knowingly, intentionally, and maliciously tampered with a captain's beverage mid-flight. That's not a policy violation, that's a federal offense. You can dress it up in corporate language all you want, but what happened on that plane was sabotage. And if this were any other captain, in any other situation, we wouldn't be talking about an investigation. We'd be talking about termination and legal consequences. A silence settled over the room, thick and heavy. One of the men shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. James Mercer sighed, rubbing a hand over his chin. Marcus, I understand where you're coming from, and you're right, this is serious. But we also have to consider optics. This is a delicate situation. Marcus let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Optics, that's what this is about. Regina's expression remained neutral. This has already gained media attention. We need to ensure we're handling it in a way that protects the airline's reputation, while also being fair to everyone involved. Marcus sat back, letting their words settle in the air between them. Fair to everyone involved. As if there were two equal sides to this. As if Cassandra had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. You want to talk about fairness? His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. Let's talk about what would have happened if I hadn't noticed. Let's talk about what could have happened at 35,000 feet if I had been incapacitated. Let's talk about what fairness looks like when I have to explain to my wife, to my daughters, that I've spent my entire career proving myself over and over again, only to be told that someone trying to sabotage me is a delicate situation. The room shifted again, discomfort moving through it like a slow tide. Regina sighed. Captain Washington, what are you asking for? Marcus met her gaze, unflinching. I want her fired, and I want Transcontinental to make it clear publicly that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. Not covered up, not excused, not swept under the rug in the name of optics. You tell the world you value safety. Prove it, because if you don't, I will. Regina studied him for a long moment. James Mercer leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, considering. The others remained silent, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Finally, Regina nodded. We will review your request and provide an official response within 48 hours. Marcus didn't move. He had seen too many decisions get lost in the limbo of reviewing requests. You have 24. Regina's eyes flickered with something close to irritation, but she nodded. 24. Marcus stood. Then I'll expect a call tomorrow. As he turned to leave, James Mercer spoke up. Marcus, he said, his tone softer, the voice of a man who had spent his career balancing between loyalty to pilots and loyalty to the system. For what it's worth, I respect how you're handling this. Marcus paused, glancing back. Respect is nice, James, but change is better. He walked out of the conference room, past the glass windows overlooking the runway, past the flight crews preparing for their next journey. The air smelled of jet fuel and rain. The city stretched out beyond the terminal, its skyline sharp against the gray sky. He pulled out his phone, dialing Asia. She answered on the first ring. How'd it go? They're stalling, he said, stepping into the cold air outside the terminal. But they know I'm not backing down. Asia was quiet for a second. Then she exhaled, a sound that carried equal parts relief and weariness. Good, because you shouldn't have to. He watched as a plane lifted off in the distance, its wings tilting into the wind, carrying people toward destinations unknown. He had spent his life believing that the sky was the one place where everything made sense, where skill and discipline were all that mattered. But the truth was, the real turbulence was always on the ground. And today, like every day before it, he would face it head-on. The morning air was thick with the scent of rain, the kind that settles deep into the concrete, leaving behind a chill that lingers even after the sun comes up. Marcus Washington stood at his kitchen counter, coffee in hand, watching the storm clouds roll past the city skyline through the wide glass window. It had been 24 hours since he sat in that conference room, staring down the airline executives who thought they could smooth over what had happened at 35,000 feet with corporate jargon and carefully measured words. He had made his choice clear: accountability, not silence. Consequences, not optics. And now he was waiting to see if they had the spine to do what was right. His phone buzzed against the countertop, the screen lighting up with a name that carried the weight of a decision. Regina Howard. He let it ring once, twice, before picking up, pressing the phone to his ear with a measured calm. Washington. Regina's voice was as polished as ever, but there was something else beneath it this time: hesitation. Captain, I wanted to inform you that after reviewing the findings of our internal investigation, Transcontinental Airways has made the decision to terminate Cassandra Whitfield's employment, effective immediately. Marcus exhaled slowly, setting his mug down with deliberate care. He had expected resistance, another round of empty reassurances, another attempt to stall. But here it was. No soft language, no middle ground, termination. Understood. Regina continued, filling the silence with carefully curated statements. We will be issuing an internal notice reinforcing our zero-tolerance policy for misconduct and discriminatory behavior. Additionally, as per your request, we will be making a public statement regarding the matter. A beat of silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of rain tapping against the glass. Marcus had spent his entire career watching incidents like this get swept under the rug, packaged neatly into nothingness. But this was different. That's the right call, he said finally, his voice even but firm. Regina sighed, the kind of exhale that comes from knowing the conversation isn't over. Marcus, this wasn't easy for the company. You've put us in a difficult position. He let out a quiet chuckle, the kind with no humor behind it. I'm not interested in what's easy, Regina. I'm interested in what's right. Another pause. For what it's worth, I respect that. Respect was nice, but Marcus had never flown for respect alone. I'll look for the statement, he said, ending the call before she had the chance to soften the victory with more corporate diplomacy. He stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of it all settle over him, not just this moment, but the years that led to it. The times he let things slide, the times he told himself to focus on flying, not fighting. The quiet indignities, the subtle doubts, the moments he had swallowed frustration and kept moving forward. It wasn't about a cup of coffee. It never had been. It was about the unspoken rules people like Cassandra had relied on for too long, the invisible barriers they assumed would always be there. It was about the next black pilot walking into a briefing room, the next flight attendant who didn't have to whisper their concerns in private. It was about the ones who came after. A soft voice broke his thoughts. That was the call? He turned to see Asia leaning against the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression knowing. She had seen him carry too much for too long, and yet, she never let him carry it alone. They fired her, he said simply. Asia stepped forward, wrapping her arms around his waist, pressing her forehead lightly against his chest. Good, she murmured, the word carrying more than just agreement. It carried relief, understanding. For a long time, they stood there, letting the quiet between them say everything that didn't need to be spoken. And then, softly, Asia pulled back just enough to meet his gaze. So what now? That was the question, wasn't it? He could go back to work, let the industry move on, return to the cockpit and do what he did best. Or he could push forward, step into the role that had been waiting for him longer than he realized. The thought had been forming in the back of his mind for days, maybe longer. The industry didn't change from the air. It changed on the ground. In boardrooms. In training programs. In policies written by people who had never lived the experiences they claimed to understand. Marcus picked up his phone again, scrolling through his contacts until he landed on the name he was looking for. James Mercer. Asia raised an eyebrow. Calling your old chief? Marcus nodded, pressing the call button. Yeah, it's time for a different kind of flight. The line rang twice before Mercer picked up. Washington, he said, sounding more awake than Marcus expected. I was just about to call you. Marcus glanced at Asia, then back out the window, watching as the storm clouds began to break, patches of blue appearing through the gray. I think we need to talk about what comes next. And just like that, the flight plan changed. The sky stretched endlessly ahead, a vast, unbroken expanse of blue that seemed to go on forever. At 39,000 feet, the world below was reduced to a distant memory. Cities shrunk to patches of light, highways tracing delicate veins across the land. Up here it was quiet, steady, a place where the air moved differently, where time slowed just enough for reflection. Captain Marcus Washington sat in the left seat of the cockpit, his hands resting lightly on the yoke, his gaze fixed ahead, but his mind was elsewhere, caught between the past and the future, between the flight he was on and the one waiting just beyond the horizon. The call with James Mercer had been the beginning of something new. Change never came all at once, never arrived like a thunderclap, shaking the world into a different shape overnight. It came in steps, in choices made when no one was watching, in voices that refused to quiet when the world wanted them to. When Mercer had offered him a role on the airline's newly formed Inclusivity and Safety Council, Marcus had hesitated not because he didn't know what needed to be done, but because he had spent his entire life proving he belonged in the sky. Could he step away from the cockpit, even a little, to change what was happening on the ground? Could he trust that he could do more from a boardroom than from the captain's seat? Asia had listened, as she always did, without interruption. And when he finally let out a breath and said, "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she had only smiled. "You don't have to be ready," she had said. "You just have to be willing." And now, here he was, flying one of his last routes before stepping into something new. The airline's statement had gone public. The media had run with the story. Cassandra Whitfield was gone. But Marcus knew this wasn't about one person. It was about all the ones who had come before her, all the quiet moments of dismissal, all the whispers behind closed doors, all the hands that had tightened around coffee cups in briefing rooms because they had learned, over time, to be careful. It was about ensuring that the next black pilot, the next Latina flight attendant, the next woman stepping into a space where she wasn't expected, where she wasn't always welcomed, wouldn't have to fight the same battles he had. Liam's voice cut through the intercom, easy and familiar. "Captain, we just got a call from dispatch. CO's office wants you in Chicago a little earlier than planned. Looks like you're moving up in the world." Marcus smirked, shaking his head slightly. "That's what they tell me." Liam glanced over, one eyebrow raised. "You sure you're ready for all this? Board meetings, policies, corporate dinners with people who love to hear themselves talk." Marcus chuckled, adjusting a setting on the autopilot. "Not at all. But that's never stopped me before." Liam nodded approvingly. "Well, for what it's worth, I think they're lucky to have you. And I mean that." Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window, at the curve of the earth, at the way the sun caught the edge of the wing, casting a golden glow over metal and sky. He had spent his whole life chasing altitude, believing that once he got high enough, once he reached the peak of his career, everything would fall into place. But the truth was, the real work had always been on the ground. It was in the way people treated each other when there was no audience, in the systems that decided who got ahead and who got left behind, in the quiet moments when someone had to choose whether to speak up or stay silent. The first time he had ever stepped onto a plane as a child, clutching his mother's hand, looking up in awe at the rows of seats, the hum of the engines, the pilots in their uniforms, he had felt something he couldn't explain. It wasn't just wonder, it was possibility. The idea that there was more, that he could go anywhere, be anything, that the world was bigger than the limits other people tried to put on him. And now, all these years later, he was carrying that feeling forward, making sure the doors stayed open for whoever came next. As the plane cut through the sky, as the city of Chicago came into view on the horizon, Marcus Washington let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his bones. He didn't know what was ahead. He didn't know how many battles were still waiting for him. But he knew this: he would face them the way he always had, with his head up, his voice steady, and the unshakable knowledge that he had earned his place, not just in the sky, but in the fight to make it better. Because change doesn't happen on its own. It happens when someone decides that enough is enough. When someone refuses to let the next generation inherit the same struggles. When someone, despite the turbulence, despite the resistance, despite the fear, takes the controls and flies straight into the storm.